Hi, everyone. Welcome to Experience Christian Church podcast. My name is Diane Karshner with our first podcast of 2021. Well, actually, to be completely honest, other than our Sunday messages, this is our very first podcast ever. So show us some grace in case we mess it up. Maybe our only one that we're ever going to do, but we're hoping it'll be the first of many more. God willing, right?
Yep.
Also on the podcast each week as our senior pastor of Experience Christian Church, Matthew Silver. Say hi to the crowds, Matt.
Hello. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Diane.
Oh, you're welcome, Matt. So today we're joined by a good friend of Experience, Lee Magness. A little bio for our listeners. We've never really covered his bio before. So I think you're going to learn some new things about our Lee Magness. He grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, but his ministry of Bible teaching has taken him around the country and around the world. He's taught at Boise Bible College, Atlanta Christian College, and for 30 years at Milligan University, including the Emmanuel Christian Seminary there at Milligan. His international teaching opportunities, where you hear this, have included India, Hong Kong, Thailand, Ghana, the Czech Republic, St. Vincent, I don't know where that is, and Cuba. He's also written several books. He teaches in different venues and provides support and guidance to Experience, which we are so blessed to have.
Oh, yeah.
And in our quest for biblical accuracy and spiritual transformation for everyone in the Experience community, including Matt and I. Many of you recognize his name and his voice from 2019 Sunday messages that he delivered at Experience and some communion meditations he did at Experience as well. So Lee is certainly not a stranger to Experience, but Matt, you and Lee are not strangers either. Why not the two of you have a little chat about how you met and some stories that we didn't know and that maybe you never wanted to tell anybody, but we'll just take it out of the video, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So, how'd you guys meet?
I'll start with, I first learned about Matt and Carrie through our son, Ethan, and his wife, Betsy. They were together on the staff of a wonderful congregation down near Baltimore. And I just heard all the time about this great couple, Matt and Carrie, Matt and Carrie, Matt and Carrie. So I learned to love and respect and admire Matt Silver long before I ever even met him. And you were connected to me through Ethan too, I guess, Matt, huh?
Yeah, I told you right away, it's a lot of times as a former youth pastor, children felt like they had to live up to their parents' expectations, but for you, you really had to live up to your son's expectation. I appreciated him so much. I was like, man, I hope Lee's as great as Ethan is, and you're even better. So that was awesome. Well, I also know Lee intimately from reading my favorite book, which is In the Breaking of the Bread by Lee Magness, Communion Meditations. Did you know I had that, Lee?
I did not, no.
I got that on Amazon. It was only a few left, so I think I paid $75 for it somewhere. Hot seller.
There's some advantages to going out of print, huh?
Hey, it was worth every penny.
Well, my other early connection with Matt, and more direct and personal, was when we studied together at a wonderful class that Matt was taking and I was teaching at Emmanuel Christian Seminary a few years ago. And that's when I came to begin to admire Matt and his spiritual insight and his pastoral heart directly through the interaction in that class. That was a great experience. And speaking of experience, I've just loved the time that I've been able to contribute a little bit to the startup here at Experience Christian Church, and it's been really valuable to me as well.
Yeah, we're so thankful. The other story I would tell you, before I met you, you did a communion meditation, which is why I thought the book was fun, at the church we were at before. And I remember like it was yesterday, and your illustration was just so powerful. It was of a father who got in front of a dog, and the dog latched on to the father and his arm bled. And you tied that into communion meditation. And that was probably 12 years, at least 10 years ago. And I remember like it was yesterday. And then sitting in your class, the way you just talk about Jesus and the life application you bring to the text and how it comes alive, anyone who hears is just blessed. So it's always good to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
Mhm.
Well, thanks, guys, for that insight into your friendship. I think there's a lot more stories in between all of those lines, but we'll get to that later. I think that the two of you, it feels like when you talk about each other that you've known each other forever, and it's probably only been a few short years. But I got to refocus now. Okay. In a recent Sunday message, Matt, you spoke about the prodigal son parable that Jesus taught in Luke 15. We studied a little bit more about it in the groups this week or the following week. So there's so much more of this parable that could possibly be covered by a Sunday message and a 1 hour group discussion. So much more. So since we have an expert with us today, that would be you, Lee.
Mhm.
We want to explore it a little bit further. So let's start from the beginning. Lee, when you first started really digging into this parable, what surprised you the most?
Well, I've been teaching this parable for 45 years, in my New Testament classes. But when I retired from full-time teaching at Milligan, I started a 3-year investigation of the parable. I just wanted to explore everything about it and what people had said about it, how they interpreted it, and how it had impacted people. Turns out it's impacted the world of art and music and literature, and it's just fascinating. And my first real, I would have to say, discovery is what a bad job we did giving a title to Jesus' parable. Jesus told this parable, but he didn't give it his own title. We did. And that parable, the prodigal son, is problematic in a couple of ways that just really kind of overwhelmed me. Number one, I realized we call it the prodigal son, and none of us has a clue what the word prodigal means. That strikes me as a problem, right?
True.
So number one, we either ought to drop the word prodigal or we ought to figure out very quickly what in the world that word means. And I think we need to take the second path, figure out what prodigal means. Matt actually did a great job explaining the word in that recent sermon that you're referring to. But we always need to remind ourselves, what are we talking about when we call this the prodigal son? The other immediate conviction that I came to is that by calling it the prodigal son, we ignore the main dynamic of this parable. It begins, in Jesus' words, there was a man, that's the father, who had two sons. Yeah. So by calling it the prodigal son, we're putting all the focus on that younger son, the runaway guy, right? And we're almost totally ignoring the older son, and most problematic of all, we're ignoring the main character of the parable, the man, and that's the father. So that's what really hit me. And those are a couple of things that I like to emphasize as I teach through this parable now.
Great. Matt, how did you teach what the word prodigal means? Refresh our memory about how you presented the whole idea of something called the prodigal.
Yeah, it was extravagant or wasteful. And I had probably my first deep look into it was as I looked towards Tim Keller's book. He called it the prodigal God, and he introduced the concept of God being extravagant and wasteful with his grace. And that really affected me because I believe on our spiritual journey, it's always trying to understand God for who he is versus the lenses in which we see him, which is based on our own experience, and trying to just understand God is a lifelong pursuit, obviously.
Yeah. All these years I thought prodigal meant runaway. Yeah, and I think most people do think that. So the prodigal son leaves, he squanders everything. He returns to be greeted by a big party, but in the shadows is his older brother, like you mentioned, Lee, the one that didn't leave, who describes himself as the one, all these years I've been loyal to you. Give us a picture of this older son, the one that we don't hear too much about.
Yeah, well, let me start by saying what I think is really prodigal about the prodigal son, the younger one, and then I can explain about the older one, I think, a little better. What was it that was prodigal? What did he waste, according to Matt's good definition there? it's not just that he was rebellious in his behavior. It's not just that he was a runaway. It's not that he went to a far country. It's not that he wasted his resources. All those things are true, but that's not really the main thing he wasted. What he wasted was his relationship with his father. He broke relationship with his father. He disrespected his father. He wished his father was dead. He never forgot his father, because even in the far country, he kept remembering how his father treated people and how his father would be treating him if he was back there. But he broke his relationship with his father. Now, let me jump to the older son, which is what you asked me to comment on. The thing that's fascinating there is that even though the older son did not rebel, did not demand his inheritance, did not wish his father dead, did not run away to a foreign country, did not waste his resources on riotous living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In all those ways, the two brothers are completely different. But he did totally waste his relationship with his father. Even though he stayed at home, the end of the parable shows us that he had lived a life in proximity to his father, lived in the same house, but in total resentment and rejection of the father's good gifts and good grace. So, in those two ways, in that way, the two sons are virtually identical. They wasted a relationship. And that is a message that I think all of us have to take very carefully from this gospel. Some of us are have lived rebellious lives. We've let our lives just go off in all kinds of self-destructive directions. We've hurt other people. We've hurt ourselves. We've marred our relationship with God. Others of us have remained, what the world would call faithful and loyal, and we still go to church and we still pray and we read the Bible occasionally and things like that. It seems like we're not rebellious. We haven't run away to a far country. But I promise you, you can do those things, those superficial acts of religiosity, and still be far, far from God in your heart. And so these two brothers, these two sons here, kind of symbolize for us two paths that may or may not lead to a good relationship. And we need to be really careful that we don't live prodigal lives that waste our good relationship with God.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. That's a lot to take in, a lot to think about. Thanks, Lee. Matt, when you were speaking about this in your sermon, you really had an interesting take on that older son. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Which part are you talking about? Refresh my memory.
Just the way that you compare the older son and the younger son. And again, along the same lines as we're talking about now, it's just that older son staying at home, being the loyal, the one that was right. Just based, both of you were raised on farms. So you have that idea of that working hard at home, being what you needed to be on the farm. Relate that for us to this story.
Yeah, one of the discussions that I like to have in a small group setting is I encourage folks to think about a friend's house where they felt like they could live in the home, and just give them this attitude of just peace. Like my friend Rob, I called his dad. He called me his number two son, and I'd have refrigerator rights, and I could go in whenever I wanted, didn't have to knock. And it was just this feeling of at peace, relational proximity. It was relaxed. It was everything you'd want it to be. And then I had another friend who his whole demeanor changed when his dad pulled into the driveway. And that was because his dad was mean. And until he got about 30 seconds to see what kind of mood his dad was in, he had no idea what he was getting. And two different homes within a half mile apart from each other, but two very different environments. And for me, that's helpful to think in relational terms of how these two brothers would have saw their dad. One, perhaps the younger son just took advantage of what he had. We don't know the heart condition, but I just want the stuff. And the older son also just really wanted the stuff. Both wanted his stuff as a means to an end, and neither wanted to care and prioritize that relationship.
Yeah.
And so I think any of us can find ourselves in this prayer rhythm where our prayer rhythm is less relational and more about the stuff. God, I need. God, I want. Please provide. And I've seen people, when they don't get the prayer answered the way they want, they are mad because they don't see God in relational terms of a father who loves and says yes and no and wait. They
Exactly.
see God as a supplier of things.
Mhm.
You probably heard the term, God is the great vending machine, that we expect to get something in return. And
Uh-huh.
both children wanted stuff, but just went about it in different ways.
Exactly. So then, Lee, where does the father figure into all of this? How did his behavior cause such annoyance in the older son, or at least appears that way? In fact, I'd love to hear from both of you on this, since both of you had some take on this.
Well, the father is just overwhelmingly gracious toward the younger son. And unfortunately, the older son didn't recognize that the father had been just that gracious to him as well.
Yeah.
And so by not recognizing that, it led to a lot of resentment. What we see in the father here is just this overflowing graciousness. First of all, he gave the son his inheritance, which he wasn't really supposed to do until he was on his deathbed, but he went ahead and gave the younger son his half inheritance. That kind of giving was an act of grace. And then he let him leave home. I mean, he could have done a whole lot more to keep him there, but he gave him space, he gave him time, he let him go to the far country. Some people have blamed the father for that. You know, why didn't he keep him there? Why didn't he pursue him when he figured out where he was? Why didn't he go and bring him back? But I think it's part of God's grace to give us space and give us time, even when it's kind of in a rebellious context. And then when the younger son did wise up and return, the father ran to him. People who have studied behavior patterns of fathers in the Middle East have universally reported that fathers just don't run. It's considered inappropriate socially to do that. But the father just, he doesn't care about social norms here. He's so excited to see him. He runs out and he welcomes him home. And then he restores the signs of the young man's sonship. Now, notice I didn't say he restores his sonship, because I'm convinced that in the father's mind, the younger son never quit being his son. Now, in the son's mind, he thought he had.
Right.
Not in the
That's a
father,
great point.
not in the father's mind. He was always the son. So what he does is restore the signs of his sonship. The ring, which is a
Mhm.
symbol of status, and the robe, which is a symbol of sonship, and then the sandals. Slaves were not allowed to wear sandals. Only legitimate,
Hmm.
children were allowed to wear sandals. So these are the signs of sonship. And then the list goes on of the father's graciousness. He restored the son's place not just in the family, but in the whole community. When
Yeah.
he insisted that the whole town come out for the celebration, that could have been a nuclear family party, but instead
Mhm.
the whole village was expected to come.
Yeah.
And then the father, of course, tried to engage the older son as well. So there's just this overflow of graciousness from the father. And unfortunately, the older brother had a hard time recognizing
Yeah.
that was all available to him as well.
Yeah. There was a story I read one time when you were talking about the father running, that when they ran, he would have had to lift up his robe to run and expose his ankles, which was not done in those days. So I can just see this old guy like tromping down the street with his with his robe lifted all the way up. I think that would be such a picture of absolute adoration for the boy that was coming at him. I just think that would be a beautiful picture. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
One thing I
go
want to say
ahead.
about that I thought was so interesting culturally is we don't understand the insult that would have been to the entire community. And coming out of the Christmas season, I've always heard where, Joseph had the right to divorce Mary quietly, and it was this big exercise of grace right there. And Dr. Magnus, you can speak to this probably more so than I, but every commentary I've read said that the father could have really had him quite punished severely for what he had done and not given that inheritance, and instead had him excommunicated or worse. And so that level of grace is just phenomenal. And then that older son, per your point, I think we like grace when it's us. We like to see justice in others. Certainly,
True.
he was not interested in justice for his own sake of how equally rude he was to his father.
Yeah.
You don't reprimand a father that way.
One great New Testament teacher who has taught over in the Middle East for decades regularly went around with this parable and had Arab men read this, and many of them were unfamiliar with it. And they'd be shocked by the story, and they would say, now, what should the father have done when the younger son came home? And they all give the same answer. He should slap him on his cheek with the back of his left hand, which was the ultimate insult. The left hand is the dirty hand in that culture. Mm-hmm. And then tell him to get lost. And
wow.
Not let him in the house even.
Wow.
So knowing what the contrast was, like you're pointing out, the father's behavior here is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, in verse 32, the father says, "We had to celebrate because your brother was dead and is alive again." Sounds a bit like the gospel. Was it supposed to? Is that like a trick question that he was thrown at him, or was he hoping everybody remembered the prodigal son's story, after he was crucified and was dead and came back to life? Is this a plant? What do you think?
I haven't thought that deeply about it. I just love how the father put the emphasis on the relational setting that he is your brother. When he said, "This son of yours is," and he goes off and said, "This son of yours has done," and like all siblings do, he rats him out and gives them the worst case scenario of everything he did, right? And when he used that language, "this son of yours," the father was reinstating, like, "No, this brother of yours," and parallel language to say, you may wish that you can wash your hands of him, but I'm not washing my hands of him. And in fact, because I haven't, you cannot. He is your brother.
He's still your brother.
Yeah.
I like the way you asked the question, Diane, about, isn't this the gospel, kind of the gospel in miniature? And yes, it is, as long as you realize that there's a kind of a missing element. As I said a few minutes ago, a lot of people have wondered why the father didn't pursue the son or, control the son. And I've already given my opinion. I think it flows out of his grace that he doesn't. But what several people have pointed out is that it was the elder son, actually, who should have pursued the younger son into the far country. That would have been his responsibility, not the father's. And the fact that he did not, and that he just kind of stayed at home and continued to live in this loveless, resentment-filled relationship with the father working on the farm, shows the older son's failure. His original failure, the one we see, is his failure to welcome his younger brother home and go into the party. The failure that we don't recognize is because he didn't do it, go and rescue him. And as the wonderful, wonderful spiritual writer Henry Nouwen has pointed out, Jesus in the gospel story is our elder brother. And he did go into the far country when God, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son. While we were still sinners, while we were dead in our trespasses, while we were still living in the far country, Jesus came for us and in our behalf. So in that sense, Jesus kind of lived out and fleshed out and fulfilled all the promises of the prodigal son's parable and acted like the true elder brother should have.
That's
Yeah,
great.
I would imagine in that society, what you just explained would have been much more evident to them and to the listeners than it would be to me, to me in this society today, because I have never heard that explained that way. And it's just so powerful to think about Jesus being that older brother that did it right. Yeah, that's great. Wow, you sure did give me a lot to think about here, both of you. So I need to re-listen a couple of times to grasp a hold of all that's there in this, what I used to think was just a story about a runaway kid. So thanks, Lee, for joining us and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom about this parable. For our listeners who are thirsting for more about Lee and the prodigal son or the prodigal sons, you may want to stop by Lee's website that's dedicated to this very thing, prodigalsall.com. Prodigalsall.com. And it has so much stuff in there, but what's really exciting on that site is Lee mentioned at the beginning about art and literature and how this story is interwoven into the art and literature all through the centuries since. You'll see some teaching on that stuff that is just so amazing when you look at some of this famous artwork and you look at it for the first time through eyes that might understand it a little bit more, it just comes to life. So I would welcome all of you just to go on that site and see it. Also, a good book that that Matt mentioned at the beginning of our podcast was by Tim Keller, Prodigal God, which really goes into the whole father storyline in the prodigal son story. So that's worth investigating as well. So Matt, you want to finish us up?
Oh yeah, I have two encore questions. You know, it's never over
Good.
when we
Of
say
course
it's
you
over.
do.
One was, and Diane, you're doing a great job because you have the impossible job of keeping me on task. So that's impossible. You know that. So.
Yeah, now we're cutting this off now. So he thinks he's on video right now, but he's not.
Well, that's why I hit record. I love the depiction you have of art. And that I was so glad that Diane pointed that out. I love what you said. I think it was Rembrandt, how he paints the older brother in the shadows and hidden. What were some of the other really intriguing art pieces that really jump out at you?
Oh, let's see. One of them is a three-piece painting. One shows the younger son running away. One shows him coming back home, and one shows a really angry older son. It's set in the American West, and everybody's looks like the cowboys.
Yeah.
I'll say. And in the right hand panel with the older son, he's wearing a cowboy hat and breaking his guitar over his knee. The guy's a country music singer. He's a guitar player. And he's so ticked off about the way the father has welcomed home this renegade son that he actually breaks his guitar in half. I'm a guitar player. That breaks my heart. Yeah. Here's what I love about that painting. In the two side panels where the younger son is running away, and then the one on the right where the older son is getting so angry, the the artist has painted the face of the father watching them. The father is present, even though the father doesn't actually go into the far country, or he, eventually has to go out and look for the older son. The father is always with the two sons, even when the two sons think they are far away from the father. It's those kinds of insights that you get from some of the great art of the prodigal son that really moved me and has really actually helped me understand the parable better.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I'd like to hear each of you. Diane, you included one of your favorite things about the parable, and I'll go first. I think the parable just reaffirms the divinity of Jesus because of the complexity of the narrative. That Jesus is telling this story, a Galilean carpenter, with such intensity that we can look at it from so many angles, and the way he leaves out so many details so the story can become so personal in that it's relationally driven. And his original audience, what their take on that would have been. And the fact he cuts it off, that he leaves it unknown, and that he inserts us into the narrative. And what a challenge it is. And through the book that we've been reading, the Fully Devoted book, it's easy to portray yourself as either the younger son or the older son. The complexity of the tale is, how am I like the younger son who loves to go off and find pleasure outside of God? How am I like that older son who likes to judge other people who go out and get pleasure when they shouldn't, or pleasure that I can't have, that I want to live the good life? And all of this is just, Lee, you said you gave yourself, was it 3 years to study it intently?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're still learning and gaining insight. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I look at it even much more simplistic than that, Matt. I've seen, over the years, I always thought it was one son, and I always thought he was a runaway. And the more I study it, the more I hear teaching about this, like Lee's teaching, it has simplified it for me. And to know that I am both. I am both the runaway and I am the one that stays home and judges everybody else. It makes it very clear that I am in gross need of a father like that, who will accept me. And the pictures that you just defined, with the father looking down over both of them, knowing that whichever son I'm choosing to be today, that the father's still with me. And that just means everything to me and to my faith.
Yeah. As Matt pointed out in his recent sermon on the prodigal son, this is the third of 3 parables that follow this theme. And it all begins in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, where we hear who Jesus is actually talking to. He's talking to a group of Pharisees,
right,
who are the legalists, who think they've got it all right with God, and tax collectors, who are told every day that they are renegades and rejects because they work for the pagan Romans. God doesn't love them anymore. And so that's the context in which we told these parables. And that context applies directly, as you're saying, Diane, to each of us and to the communities in which we find ourselves living, that God loves the lost and the legalist. And some of us have a little bit of both in us. And,
yeah, we do.
We need to focus on how God's love extends to both of those groups.
Yeah,
and both sides of us.
yeah, absolutely. Matt, you want to close us in prayer, unless you have like 5 more questions?
Oh, I have 7, but we better go ahead and end. Yeah, I'll close prayer. Jesus, we love you, and we're thankful for the opportunity to just discuss the story, and a story that really, really has so much depth and is just not something that look at once and think we have it all figured out, but God, something we continue to revisit, to marvel at how you love each of us individually. If we were thinking this of a continuum, we could say how we're acting today or this very hour, and to know that you have love and grace for us is just amazing. Thank you for Lee. Thank you for Diane. Thank you for this time we spent together. And thank you for the listeners. I pray they'll continue to draw closer to you, that they'll look at you in new ways and new insights. And we're thankful for the gift of this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody. Tune in next time for our next podcast, whenever that will be.
Hey, could be tomorrow, could be 2022. We'll get it figured out.
You never know.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, Lee.